Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. I'm Charles Shepard, the President and CEO of the FWMoA Museum of Art. And tonight I'm joined by Magda Salvesen, art historian and curator of the estate of Jon Schueler, and author of the Artist Estate's Reputations in Trust. I am very excited to be talking with Magda about the exhibition of Jon's work, Lost Man Blues, which is now on view at the FWMoA Museum of Art until June 13th. Magda, welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Hello.
You know, we faced all these technological difficulties as we try to get to our audiences, but I think we're there.
Yes.
I understand that we're live. That's good. And I want to tell the audiences that Magda and I have had some very nice chats while we're waiting to get live to you.
Yes.
And we've been chatting on and off for, basically a little bit more than a year, getting excited about the exhibit, getting excited about knowing each other. And let me ask you at this point, Magda, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because you have a wonderful background.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Charles. Well, I was born in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I was brought up there. And I was thinking again that looking back, I think that I had a very privileged childhood, in that it was happy, it was very secure, it was very middle class, and very conventional. It did, I suppose that I came out of that childhood quite naive, but at the same time, I was one of 6 children, and so there was a great deal of fun and games and good times at that point. But then I went on to the University of St Andrews for a first degree. And it was in the middle of that I then got a scholarship to come to the United States. And that was very significant in my life. It was a full scholarship, everything was paid for. And I was extremely lucky to get that. And of course, it endeared me to the United States, which I think led in later to when I met Jon Schueler. But then I just had a year in the States, and I went back to St Andrews, finished at St Andrews, and then went on to the Courtauld Institute. And that was where I did my training for art history. And so I always imagined that what I was going to either teach art history or go into a museum. And that seemed to be the sort of 2 things that I thought of, that I was thinking about. But actually, I landed up as an administrator, an arts administrator, rather than either of those 2 things.
Well, actually, it's fascinating because that is the route that one would follow, and it's a noble route. It's a good route, and in some respects, ending up as an art administrator gives you a lot more power because you get to choose later on which side of the fence in each case you want to be on. I have to tell you too, I have to share with you in the audience that,
yes,
my people came from Scotland as well. And they were boat builders, and they went to Nova Scotia to build boats. And then they moved to Maine to build boats. So we have that in common. We have that Scottish background in common, which I think tells us to be strong and persevere.
Oh, good. Yes, that's a terrific interpretation.
That's the way I'd like to see it. Now, tell me a little bit about the Courtauld, because the Courtauld is a wonderful place to be. How did your studies go there?
Yes, it was terrific 2 years. Extremely challenging for me. You had to get a lot done as usual, for an MA in 2 years, and I did I don't know whether it was a good idea or not, but for my thesis, you did I think it was the first year that they gave you the opportunity of doing your thesis in 2 parts, and one was to go to the Tate. And to really help them catalogue some of their uncatalogued paintings, and especially the 19th century ones. And so I think I did about a sixth of them. And then at the same time, the other part was writing up about the context of these artists. So it was part writing and part trotting off to the Tate and looking at the paintings and then going through endless journals and other taking up references to do with that. So that was my experience at the Courtauld, and in some ways it was a bad choice because it was 19th century genre painters, and I got rather fond of them, but actually it didn't lead into anything that I dealt with. So there were some of my colleagues that they did their thesis on something which then in a way they built on for the rest of their lives. They continued being an expert on that particular artist and publishing and things like that, or else they were in a museum which very much had that period. But in any case, that was how it went. So yes, I mean, there weren't very many people there. It was in the days of Anthony Blunt. You did feel as though somehow or other, you had got in, and I was very thrilled about that, indeed, and took it very seriously as well. And traveled during the summers of that time. And then I also actually, two of us, it was during the time when Florence was completely flooded. And so two of us got permission must have been the beginning of December. It was towards the end of the term to go to Florence and just to help in whatever way we could with some of the artwork or the books that were damaged by the flood. And so it was cold, it was uncomfortable, it was dreary, it was muddy. There'd been an awful lot of damage in Florence, but somehow or other, as art history students, we were just so thrilled, to be there and to think that we were helping in some, very, very small way.
Well, and indeed you were, because as everybody, or as most people know, in retrospect, that those floods were devastating, and truthfully, the on the ground work of an art historian is to learn how to cope with these things, learn how to help with these things, and there's no better way to learn it than actually showing up in a situation like that, which I commend you for immensely, and also to go back to your notion about what you studied at the Courtauld. Similarly, I started out at the Clark Institute.
Yes.
Thinking I wanted to be a Renaissance person.
Yes.
I had no idea that everybody was a Renaissance person. There were no jobs. But I think by getting that grounding in the 19th century or the Renaissance or some earlier period, I have found, and I'm sure you have found, that what you have then is the perfect foundation for understanding everything in modern and contemporary art based on a classical model, because it hasn't changed. The appearance has changed, but the judgments have not changed. And so, I commend you entirely. And the Courtauld, such a wonderful place to go, and that you got the experience in Florence as well, and those dreadful floods. Good for you. Good for you.
Well, thank you.
You had a transition point, though, that after all that good classical study, you encounter the contemporary movements, the modern movement, the contemporary movement, and Jon, and what artists of that generation are trying to accomplish. How did you adjust to that?
Yes, well, I think in between, I worked for the Scottish Arts Council, and that was extremely helpful because I was called an exhibition officer. There were three of us, And at that point, the Scottish Arts Council had a gallery in Glasgow and a gallery in Edinburgh. And so our job was, we had about sort of maybe 6 or 7 exhibitions that we were in charge of. So we didn't necessarily put them together. We had experts who were putting that exhibition together, but we had to work with them. We had to see the catalogue through publication. We had to proofread. We had to do all that kind of thing. We had to help with the choosing of the poster and the publicity, and also the touring of it. And so I was traveling around Scotland, going to these shows and checking up on them. And sometimes I even had to hang them, because sometimes they went to quite small museums, and they were a bit nervous about how the exhibition might be arranged. And so they asked for one of us, the person who was in charge, to come and lay them all out and arrange them for them. And that was always quite difficult, because I always had the technicians from the Scottish Arts Council with me. So they actually did the measuring and the putting up. I just did the placing. But they sat around and looked at me, especially as maybe because I was a woman, and sort of with a look on their face said, "How long are you going to be? When can we get started? Just do it. Just get it done." And so I was, how I'm sure you do that. It's one of the most exciting things to do about an exhibition is, how do the paintings play off each other? What do they say? Are they stronger when you have 2 or 3 together? And what is the narrative that you're making within the exhibition? And then sort of finally I would get it, after much trepidation and nervousness, and asking them to change the paintings from one side to the other and do this and that, and they'd be standing there with it like this, and then they would go to it. And then there were usually 2 technicians, and they were extremely efficient, and they got the whole exhibition up in a jiffy, in a way. And and then then I would stay until the whole thing was done and then go home. Other museums, they had their own people, and they wanted to do it themselves. So then I would just visit once it was up, and see and examine it, and see that all the paintings were in good shape, and also it was great. It was such great fun getting to know who all the directors were and the curators were, and also when I used to use it as a kind of arts council, in a way a business call, of course, because what else were they interested in, and what was lacking, and what did they think about the Scottish Arts Council, and had they found that that it was actually supplying what they needed. And I also looked after the lecture program, and so we had a group of lecturers who said that they would go anywhere, paid by the Arts Council. And so I used to go and listen to them lecture, because partly I needed to know, what they were like, and to get to know them, and also because very often a small art group would ring me up, and they would say, "Now we want somebody who is not too academic, or who is much more academic than the person that we had before. We want somebody who this and this and this and this." And so of course when I first arrived, I didn't know how these people lectured. And so I was always, traveling around, listening to people, and then with the art groups, and that was good also to get to know them, and so then they could ring me up, and they just knew who I was. And so I loved that facilitating, just getting things to run more smoothly, through getting to know people and them getting to know you. And I just felt that was very full and terribly interesting for what I called my first proper job.
Well, and what a great proper job, honestly. And for those in the audience tonight, let me just elaborate for a second about the fact that, deciding to have an exhibition is the first step, but picking the work and then getting the work into the gallery and trying to decide how to display it, as Magda has so clearly said, this thing next to that thing might be brilliant, and yet the reverse might not be brilliant. So there's a great deal of work in the design of an exhibition, and the technicians, bless them, they have a big job too, to put them on the wall at the right height and light them properly. But essentially, it's the curator, as Magda was in all these situations, who they have to help them, the technicians, understand what has to be done. And there's an impatience. You're so right, Magda. The technicians want to start work as soon as possible.
Yes.
And they don't know why you're thinking about things for so long.
Yeah.
You know, you've dealt with that 100 times. I've dealt with that 100 times.
Yeah.
And you have to say, just please be patient with me,
Yes.
because we have to find the right combination.
Mm-hmm.
And the right combination will move people's hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm.
That's the outcome. We're trying to make the best outcome for the artists that we're exhibiting.
Yes.
And it's a big stress. It's a big stress. And you know, I love that you've done that over and over again and succeeded so well at that. And you and I got together talking about an exhibition. We both had an interest in Jon's Lost Men Blues.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can share our PowerPoint, we
Yes.
can talk about how we decided to have that show, how you curated that show, and all our different questions about it. I have many. So let's see if we can share a screen now and show some slides about that great project that we did together.
Great.
Should be coming up any moment now. I'm going to try to make sure that multiple people can share a screen. One of the things I bet all of us in the audience and Magda and myself, over the last year, you spent a lot of time learning how to do Zoom techniques. So here we are.
Here we are.
Here's handsome Jon.
So here's Jon. Yes, it's you know, he's in a way he's the young man who has just got his wings. You can see his wings, and you know, I think he felt that he was doing something, you know, which he believed in, but also for almost the first time that his parents approved of, that he was joined up. But there's a, you know, I love this kind of slight smugness in his smile. I mean, he looks, you know, there is a feel, you know, that he knows that he's good looking, that he's achieved. You know, a certain rank, and that everything is before him. Everything is before him. He's about to be now sent over to in this case Britain, to be a navigator.
Well, and he knows that he knows something that we now can recognize even deeper, is that this was a grand war with a great cause and strong morality, and you can feel good about that. You know, in a way that you can't feel good about everything that happened after that. But he's at a great moment in his history and America's history, and he's reflecting that, I think, in this picture.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think so. And it's not that he hadn't seen you know, death and crashes while training, because that was certainly part of it. You know, even before he got to the war zone or to Britain. But at this particular point, I think that yes, that's put behind him, and I think that those in the American Army Air Force, they felt as though they were the elite. And he had signed up actually in advance of Pearl Harbor in 1941, because politically he believed in the necessity of America getting into the European war, or in his case, the European war as opposed to the Pacific. And so and then he also wanted to choose what he was in. So he chose the Air Force. And they were, you know, you had to have more education to go into the Air Force than you did to go into the Army, for instance. I don't know about the Navy. So they thought of themselves as extremely special. And of course, they did get a very, very expensive training. all the smaller planes and graduating to the B-17s. But the B-17, was to him, and I think for everybody who flew on B-17s, it was a very special kind of aircraft. Indeed, and of course they became very possessive about their aircraft, and at the same time there was humor about it, because the B-17 that he flew in was called Bad Check, because a bad check bounces back. So a sort of wonderful young man's enthusiasm and optimism about somehow or other that they would survive. A little did they know, exactly what the circumstances were. But I think that showed that sort of aspect of Jon, I think. So there they are. There are the B-17. Sorry, Charles, you go on.
No, go right ahead.
And I think that he talked a lot about, I think, this and wrote about the loyalty that they felt to one another. I mean, I think that everybody who went through war feels, talks about this too, that in fact you have your loyalty towards your group, your crew, much more in a way than just sheer patriotism. That and especially as the navigator, and it was Jon's absolute responsibility and only responsibility. He had no backup. There was just one navigator, and that was him, and one pilot, and all the rest of it. So it's his responsibility not only to get them there, but to get them safely back again. And there was also the fear always of never being out for too long, because they didn't carry enough enough gasoline. If things went wrong and they went too far out geographically in the wrong direction or whatever, then you'd never get back again. So enormous amount of responsibility, and I think that Jon felt that greatly, and really felt his that it was his, he, of course, the pilot too, but getting there and getting back again, and whatever state your plane was in, to somehow get it back to Britain, and then you could land in the nearest airfield, or you could get back to, to your own airfield if possible. I must say, I've read, it's extraordinary. I mean, I didn't really know much about the Americans in Britain. I always knew that, of course, Britain was extremely grateful that America came into the war, and even before the war, they were, America was supplying a lot of equipment, to the Brits, but to actually have them there, was something else, and have them flying, and also, of course, to keep supplying all the, because there were so many of what they call the ships, but the planes that were shot down, and then eventually more would come, and more would come, and more would come, all being churned out in the United States. I mean, otherwise, Britain couldn't have done it, because they weren't able to produce those kinds of armaments, and they did produce some planes, but on a smaller scale.
Well, and I think Jon's role as a navigator can't be underestimated, because in fact, today we would get our GPS, yes, and find our way to the restaurant, to the market, to the hotel. Yeah. There was no GPS. This was classic navigation with a compass. Yeah. And as you say, the gasoline was limited. The length of time you could stay in the air was limited thus. And it's up to the navigator and the pilot to ensure that this team returns safely. So the level of stress on each member here, as we see these, 8 or 9 people, mm-hmm. The level of stress is very high, and it's not unexpected. I mean, these gentlemen were not raised to be aviators and fighters. They were raised to be good human beings, and they had poetry on their soul, and they had thoughts on their minds. And so, in addition to doing this job well, their thoughts are going to stray to other things that matter to them, spiritual things, soulful things, artful things. And didn't that indeed happen to Jon?
Yes, it did. I talked to, he kept in touch with one member of the crew who also wasn't killed. And I asked his widow just a few months ago. I was saying, well, that John had a very bad time towards the end of the war, and had what in those days was called battle fatigue, and then he was ultimately sent home, hospitalized, really. And I said, and I never really thought of it, but I said to the bombardier's widow, I said, well, how did Milt Conver, how did he get through the war, and also and did he go through quite a period after the war, before he settled into some kind of normalcy? And she sort of said, well, no, he made a very easy transition from war, to civilian life. And then she sort of said, well, of course, John was quite different. He was much more sensitive and much more of the creative type, and so it was, and so psychologically, that they could see afterwards, what John was going through because of what he was, somehow, and of course, John felt that his war was an absolute failure. I mean, it's one of these terrible contradictions that when you see a lot of your friends and your colleagues killed, and you are not, then there's this guilt that you haven't been killed, that you actually came back again. As well. And I think that he was, yes, I think that the whole thing of not hand to hand, of course, it's very unphysical, the violence. You are you're in a bomber, you go over to France, and you're in success is letting out all these bombs which go onto Allied territory, and which wipe out the city, Saint-Nazaire, and also Lorient, and various other places, or even going into Germany. And John was not somebody who thought in terms of them and us, allies and an enemy. But of course you have to. But at the same time, he didn't demonize the enemy, as I think some people get through wars by doing that. And the enemy is not to be thought of as in human terms almost. But of course, John didn't think like that way. So they were so when they were flying over, either they were killing French people because the bombs scattered in the wrong direction or too wider a circumference, or else they were never bombing civilians as such. They were bombing the submarine pens in Saint-Nazaire and Lorient. And then when they were over Germany, it was always, again, it was never just, it was always the marshalling yards for the trains which took all the supplies to the front and things like that. And so so it wasn't like some of the bombing which the British did on cities themselves, etc. But even so, it's you on both sides you realize that war is a failure from the very beginning. I mean, because human beings have not sorted out differences and resorting to simply killing each other. It was something very, very primitive. And I think that John, had, after the initial excitement, in a way, of being in this elite position, really, saw what war was in a much broader way, and it was nothing that you would ever, want to come about. And so I think that he was actually an extremely good navigator, evidently, but the attrition was so bad, and so many people of the Americans, because they were doing daylight bombing. The British did night bombing. the Americans did daylight bombing, partly, because in a way it's very ethical, because they said that the British were just dropping their bombs, and half the time they couldn't see where they were dropping them, and there was much more possibility of civilians, of whole cities being wiped out without even getting to the target. Whereas at least with daylight bombing, that John was his responsibility was to get to the target, and they always did. But of course, you just need a tip of the plane or whatever, for the bombs to go off course. So in any case, I mean, that this is common experience to a lot of people. But John took it very, very seriously.
Well, and that taking it that seriously, I see it as a necessity, and I also see it as a source of stress after. Even if you aren't up close, you still understand what's going on, and I think John did. And I think as I look at John's work, in the exhibit, and as I've seen it also in other pictures online, it's not that the stress shows there, but the emotion and the spirituality show in his work. How did you conceive of putting the exhibit Lost Man Blues together?
Well, yes, it came about in a very, very interesting way, because it hadn't occurred to me actually as a theme. And that when people were talking about John, they always mentioned that he was in the war, and that had influenced him. But basically, they go on and they talk about his love of Rothko, of Monet, or of Turner. Really, sort of Monet and Turner, being the main. I don't hate to think about the influences, but references in his painting.
Yeah.
So it came about because there was going to be a symposium, or there was a symposium in 2016, which was the centennial of John's birth, being born in 1916. And there was, in the usual way, the College Art Association, you can put an ad in the College Art Association asking for papers for a particular symposium. And it was being run by the University of the Highlands and Islands, and this particular campus, which is on the island of Skye. And so it was advertised for papers in Britain, but also because John was American, they wanted some American speakers, and so it was put in the CAA, and Marissa Roth answered the ad, or the call for papers, one should call it, and she wrote in with her proposal, which was to do with water. And she's really a photographer, but she'd also done photographic exhibitions on refugees, mostly refugee camps, but also various other exhibitions. And her proposal, talking about water, when she would relate her photographs of mostly being on a ship and looking down on the water, very abstract, but at the same time very close up, and it was accepted. So there we were, gathered on the island of Skye with Marissa, who had never been to Scotland, and she did, in fact, give a very lovely, paper on water and how she interpreted John to look at water. In his case, the sea and the sound of slate, and we were surrounded by all this water and the islands, and exactly what John looked at, because the island of Skye was just opposite where he had his Scottish studio. And the first person in the symposium gave a short paper on war, violence, and how he thought it affected John. And Marissa took up that idea and came to me quite a number of months afterwards, and said she had an idea for a Schueler exhibition, that could she do one which would concentrate on paintings which said something about the war. And so she chose the painting. She came here. We looked at paintings. We looked at more paintings. She spent quite a lot of time thinking of, and a lot of reading. And she came up with Lost Man Blues, as you see there, Jon Schueler, Art and War. So I have a great deal to thank Marissa Roth for, and then she wrote the essay for the brochure.
Well, and it's a grand title, and I think it gets to the heart of Jon's work. And the interesting thing to me is that you could know Jon's work without knowing the background and still love the work.
Yes.
This is gorgeous, strong, abstract work. And yet when you know Jon's story and you know his background and you know more about where some of these images could have come from, it makes so much more sense. And it also makes sense that Jon and others who were in that battle were lost men.
Yes.
And they had the blues. They were trying to do the good thing, but it was a stress.
Yes, and Jon, not with all of his titles, but with many of his titles, there's also a kind of ambiguity about the titles. They suggest, but you're not quite sure, where your mind will go from that. And so the blues, as you said, the blues is to do with jazz. To sing the blues, and that suggests a kind of mournfulness, a sadness, a loss. And Jon played the double bass. He played jazz for quite a long time, and then he stopped playing the double bass because it kind of interrupted with painting. But then he always listened to jazz very often. In fact, it was nearly always jazz that he was listening to when he was painting. So you get the jazz suggestion, and then also the lost man. And of course the lost man could also be to do with the jazz. You had all sorts of early deaths. One of the double bassists that he so admired, Oscar Pettiford, he died early, probably of an overdose. And so there were, within that music world, there were, all sorts of difficulties, to do with, heroin or drugs or whatever. But then in a purer way, it was, I think, as you said, the lost men whose planes were shot, and from that flaming plane dropped to the ground, and then sometimes with their parachutes came up and out, and they just sailed gently down, with so there was no suggestion of violence. They were in the sky at that point. The violence was from the flak, from the parts of planes, from the fire, on the fire, etc. But also you had that beauty of the parachuted men going down, whether on either side, whether they could be Germans or Americans, but at the same time, men whose parachutes didn't open. No violence at that time, but you knew that the violence was implicit in that they would land and they would probably be smashed to bits, from the fall. So he very often had these titles which are very suggestive in all sorts of ways. And so, going from the jazz to the action, and as you say, you don't need to know. Because basically he channeled his experiences of violence into his interpretation of nature. So as you can see, he never painted planes or dropping planes or men who were half burnt, who were dropping to the ground. There's Lost Man Blues, but it was sort of channeled into how he interpreted nature, and especially a kind of primordial nature, which he thought that the west coast of Scotland, looking out where there are very few people, it's almost uninhabited, and you look out, across these bodies of water, and you see the weather, and the weather is very, very changeable, very unpredictable, and weather, of course, was a beautiful metaphor in a way, or realistic, because it goes from being extremely violent. And of course, and Jon had seen violence of the weather in America, but in Scotland, you also get the very changeable weather, and the winds, and the skies and the clouds, and the squalls that come in, and so it was translated really into into nature. And I think you look at that painting and you do think of skies, and so not more directly, but as you said, it adds another layer. And Jon liked fullness, he liked layers, he liked suggestiveness. And so there were other painters, during his lifetime, who said what you see is what you get, in terms of geometric painting, of straight colors, being on the surface of the canvas, not going back into space. Jon liked the opposite. Going back into space is going into infinity, is going into further layers of what you see and what you don't see, what you think is there. And we all have that experience when we're looking out to sea. You have a very often a horizon, but where is that horizon? How far away? What's beyond it? If you go to that horizon, then of course another horizon has arrived. And so nature. Nature held all of those ideas for Jon, and and I sort of feel that the colours there, they do suggest jazz somehow or other, and blues, the blues where there's a little areas of blue, but also in a way the loss. I mean, the red also stands for violence, but stands for loss, stands for blood. So one can you don't need to take it too far. Everybody can take it in their own direction, but there's a suggestiveness and of course a wonderful beauty in the way that Jon painted these paintings. He was an absolutely superb craftsman in the way that he held his brush, that he used color, that there's color below color. It's very complicated. And so, you can have very handsome paintings where you have great areas of one color, as against another geometric area of another color. But it's a different kind of painting, a different kind of wish on the part of the artist as to what you want to suggest and what you want to communicate. And Jon was very keen about arousing memories, illusions, getting other people's, the connection with other people was for them visually to get into the painting in their own way, not necessarily in his way, so we can talk about what influenced him, but it's also up to the spectator in a way to be open to these other illusions and suggestions and their own experiences, as well.
Well, and I agree with you totally, and we have to acknowledge that Jon carried forth, I would say, a Rothko-esque commitment to abstraction that established a mood, that established poetry, that established feelings, and they're not meant to be literally analyzed, they're meant to be felt. That's it. And he's come after some of these artists like Rothko and been able to extend the assignment, I think, that they gave themselves and succeed so well at it. And then when you realize at the same time that Jon was in the skies, and the skies are revealing God's truth and weather's truth. And so they're very emotive paintings. They're very, strong feeling paintings, passionate paintings, and they're very spiritual paintings in my mind.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think so. I mean, one can sit and look at them, and people talk about how owners of paintings sometimes say to me, "Oh, Magda, our Jon Schueler looks like one painting in the morning when we have breakfast, and then it changes as the light changes." And we're always going back to the painting because it depends upon the light as to what it looks like at that particular point, and possibly also your own mood as well. And yeah, yes.
I think definitely.
Mm.
Do you think that painting and his immersion into the painting helped John heal after the war?
Yes, I do. At the same time, I hadn't really thought of it in such a strong way as Marissa does, the curator of the exhibition, because after the war, he and his wife went to California, and he writes in his own book, which is called The Sound of Slate, a painter's life. That it was really the building that he did, and two types of building. One was going to be a kind of jazz spot that he was working with Anita O'Day, and Dizzy Gillespie lived down the road and things like that. And then it all came to a crashing end because they hadn't got the permission to build in that particular place, and it was a flood zone, and so they had to leave it. And then he built the house for himself and his wife and his two children, so I think the digging, the build, the heaving things around, everything to do with that. He did a lot of the digging out himself. That was the first stage, and then he was ready to go to San Francisco and to get a job teaching English literature, because his MA was in English literature. So he really wanted to be a writer, but he was blocked after the war. He was blocked quite a bit, in the writing thing. And so, how was he going to support his family? So he could have had that career, as an academic, teaching English literature and then writing in the rest of the time. But he did start at the California School of Fine Arts, and he changed, and he seemed to, he then dedicated himself really to painting. So I'd always interpreted it really as somebody who finds something which they didn't even know was going to be important to them, and then as the more they did it, the more important it comes, and until it becomes the major form of communication. But Marissa interprets the actual painting as a form of he would never have used the word therapy. And we talk a lot about looking at paintings as a term of the way of therapy. This is a kind of the last maybe 15 or 10 years, or especially even lately, of healing therapy. To go to parks and to gardens and to look at paintings. Well, I don't think he would actually have seen his career in that way. But at the same time, I really respect Marissa for what she said, and I think certainly that he gave up teaching English literature, and he did. There's a wonderful letter where he says that what he's going to do is he's going to paint. He's going to paint. That was going to be his main form of communication. And so even though he did actually continue to write through his life, he did think of himself first and foremost, and he wanted, what he had to say was really through the paintings. And he was extremely serious about that. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He could be very ironic, and about everything, but never about paintings. The paintings were a form of communication, which wasn't the only form of communication in life, but there was no comedy, or whatever, but it was his form of communication. It was, and the rest, and which was just part of life, but it was a very, very important part of life, was to say what he had to say, through painting.
Well, and in many respects, when you think about it, your ability as an artist to be open and sincere and committed through the visual is probably the highest form of expression. And you could say many things, you could write many things, but I think Jon gives us a great example of the fact that through his images, through his beautiful abstractions, he is able to say so much more than you could actually articulate in the English language.
Yes,
I really do think so.
yes, no, I think that's beautifully put. And then this is an example, of one which Marissa wanted to show the ones which would suggest. Which had some of them have titles like Saint-Nazaire, to do, which we saw earlier, which we saw, but there was also that other side where he felt that there was tremendous power in the quietness of nature. Itself, tremendous power. It wasn't just kind of, pretty, lovely, oh, it's a gorgeous day kind of thing. But, and there were two things that he talked about. One, was the sundog. And the sundog was a sign. He used to go out with the fishermen in Malé, who were very, very generous to him, and he was because he didn't actually help or do anything on board. It would have been dangerous for him to be careering around on board. They were very small ships. But he went out, and it was very important for him to be in the weather, absolutely, absolutely immersed in it in every way. And there was one time when there was just a glow in the sky, and the skipper, he said to the skipper, "God, look at the beauty of this sign that's there." And the skipper just looked at him and said, "Oh yes, well, to us it's the sign of the gale." And that's the kind of complexity and that Jon loved, the sign of the gale, but so powerful. You didn't, and or with fall of snow. I mean, that was one of those ones where how far could you go to suggest not very much happening, but yet it's both so painterly and it's so abstract, and yet at the same time it is suggestive of nature. And he wanted those two sometimes tensions in a way, I think, though it's not, it's obvious that are they clouds? Does everybody, mist or weather of some sort? I mean, I think that weather in a way is what but he wanted to also, to suggest, I think that, he was brought up to think that a man went in a certain direction and showed certain traits, but at the same time, I think that there was, and I think maybe a lot of our artists have a kind of what we would traditionally call a kind of femininity, within their. We all do, both sides, and I think that this complete gentleness and almost nothingness. Also, just appealed to him too, and so beautiful. Just as the violence, in Lost Man Blues, it's not just pure violence, and it doesn't suggest human violence, but it does suggest, it does suggest, the rawness in a way of nature. But nature is fickle, very fickle. And so this is the other side. And you also, of course, love the idea that so much, whether it's snow or mist or whatever, is hidden, that nothing is too obvious, that you have to, that the hiding and this thing about going behind and reaching further, what else is there, opening up, going through these veils of weather. And so, so that that seems to be such a rich seam that he has. And maybe to me it always seems a much a very embracive theme. He saw so much could be expressed, just through looking at weather, looking at the skies. But it was a humanness as well as pure nature, and as well as being a painterliness.
I think you've described it so well, and as you look at the paintings and you think about what you're saying, it all makes such sense. I love the exhibit. I love Jon's paintings. I'm so ever thankful that you could spend some time with us tonight. I appreciate that. I love who you are and how you can articulate this. And I appreciate so much you being willing to share with us tonight. I'm sure our audience does as well. I want to thank you. I want to tell you that I look forward to talking to you more and more. And in the meantime, I'm going to just love this show.
Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you and all your team at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. I mean, I'm so pleased that it's up there. And even though I haven't been, your installation photographs, I sent them round. I have never had so many replies saying, my goodness, this exhibition looks utterly beautiful, and you know they love the combinations that you were that you were making, that you brought together. So my some really very deep thanks to you, Charles, and everybody at Fort Wayne Museum of Art. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you, and to our audience, thanks for joining us tonight. I hope you have a good rest of your evening. And Magda and I are going to retire now and relax and have a bit of nice evening in front of us as well. Magda, thank you again.
Not at all. Thank you, Charles. Thank you.
Okay, I will bring us to a close if I know how to do that. You know, we have to try to learn to know how to do this. Thank you again.
Not at all. Yes, our new skills.